Okay, again. So welcome again to this conversation. My name is Reverend Dr. George Walters-Sleyon. I am the director, founder of the Center for Church and Prison. I'm also an AME minister, pastor of St. James AME Church, and I'm also a professor at Bunker Hill Community College and other places as well. It's a delight to have you all to discuss a very important topic, the transatlantic slave trade, its mutations, and the calls for reckoning. We have gathered some very impressive panelists to discuss. So we are delighted that you have taken the time to join us to be a part of this. It's quite a delight. So I will begin by introducing our speakers and the format. I'll introduce our speakers, and then afterwards, I will give a brief presentation, and then they will give a 2 minutes each remark with respect to their interest in the topic, what they're going to be saying. Thereafter, consecutively, they will talk about their topic. They'll be given 10 minutes or less to talk about their topics. And thereafter, we'll open it up for Q&A. Okay, we'll open it up for Q&A. So everyone, please mute yourself, remain muted. Okay, this is being recorded, and want to say thank you. So we have Dr. Jonathan Simmons of UC Berkeley, and he is a very prolific criminologist and lawyer, a legal scholar as well at UC Berkeley, and he's written several books on criminology, its intersection with criminal justice and the legal system as well. So he'll be talking from that particular perspective. He comes with a wealth of information and insight as well. So we are delighted to have him. Welcome, Dr. Simmons. And then we have Anthony Joseph Pfister, who is well known in the Boston area as well, a former NAACP president, but he's also the chairperson for the Reparation Committee or Commission in Boston at City Hall. So he works directly with the team responsible for reparation. So we are delighted to have him here. He'll be talking about several topics, several issues in light of his legal background as a legal scholar. But all your questions with respect to reparation, we are glad he's here to answer all of them. Also, we welcome Dr. Tony Pfister. We are delighted to have the Reverend Dr. Imani-Sheila Newsome. She holds 2 degrees in education, MDiv and DMin in church history. And she's been a dean and university chaplain at Marsh Chapel, Boston University. And she's been a seminary faculty member as well, and dean at Boston University School of Theology. She has pastored 3 churches, and she's now director of the Long Walk Home Collective, a Long Walk Home Collective rooted in the Black church and a theological tradition that holds that every person bears the image of God. A trust that the same God who calls people to serve also desires their wholeness. This work tunes towards the places where endurance is settled in the body and asks what restoration under God's care might look like. As part of the collective, people are reminded that in God's economy, they are not tools for service, but beloved persons allowed to rest and remain called. So we are delighted to have Dr. Imani-Sheila Newsome with us, and I want to say welcome. Welcome. And the next speaker he's on his way, is Reverend Dr. Samuel Green Jr. He's on his way, and we are delighted to have him. He served as a great consultant to the African Methodist Episcopal Church and has done several work with respect to the intersections of the Black church and race as well. So he brings a wealth of information. And we're delighted delighted that he's here and grateful for the work he does in with the AME on a larger scale. Okay, so thank you again for your time here. And I will just begin with by sharing these slides. Let's see if I can just do this. Okay, yeah. All right, that's our flyer. So in this brief presentation, what I want to do is give you a background, a brief background of to the book itself and to the arguments here. And this is what uh, an author said, quoted from the book. He said, regardless of the intertwined past, the rehabilitation of the South by whites would not just purposefully exclude blacks. As the time passed and opportunity permitted, former slaves would be compelled to come to perform the rebuilding of the South as well in a system of labor hardly distinguishable in its brutality and coercion from the old slavery that preceded it. And this is very important. It gives you insight into the implications of the Black Code. Now, fundamental and central to the entire volume, to both books, is what I call Lockean slavery. Lockean slavery, because Locke served as an important, absolutely important interlocutor. Okay, considered the father of Western liberalism. Locke was engaged in the promotion of the British Commonwealth. In fact, his writings, to a large extent, and publications provided the intellectual background, political, philosophical, social, economic background to the spread of the British Empire. He was the brain behind it. Okay, and fundamental to that is his publication of the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina in 1689 that would provide a template for all other constitutions in the British colonies, and the spread of the British Empire. But this is what he says with respect to slaves. He says slaves are captive through just war. That is, the slaves, he says, were aggressors. Okay, Europeans that went to capture slaves or to get slaves were engaged in a just war. So he says slaves are made rightless property through conquest. By virtue of the fact that Europeans conquered them, they are rightless property, and that the engagement of Europeans in Africa to capture Africans was a just war, and that Africans that were captured were just their property through conquest. He said the value of the slave's humanity is strictly one of economic utility. That is basically economic units. Slaves are wild beasts that must be tamed by slavery. Okay? And there is the concept of enlightenment humanity becomes absent. Again, in a newsletter I did send out, the Enlightenment pioneers did not see the need to extend to Africans, Black Africans, the virtues and civility of the Enlightenment. He says that the discretionary power of the slave master towards his slave is absolute, and that's part of the fundamental constitution. Slaves are legally dead. That is, they've got no right and only useful to their master. Who they are is determined by their master. The slave master has the right to determine the value of the slave's humanity. To determine the value of the slave humanity. He says here, in the fundamental constitution now, he says 110, that's every free man of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slave, of what opinion or religion whatsoever. And that's very important. That's very important. Locke, this father of Western liberalism, would opine, would brazenly say that the slave master has absolute right to treat his slave whatever way he desires. He said, no cause, whether civil or criminal, of any free man shall be tried in any court of judicature without a jury of his peers. That is, every white man, every white person, okay, will only be tried by a white person. A Black person cannot be tried by Black people. Okay? In the fundamental constitution, he goes on, he says, according to Locke, Africans are slave and civilly dead in civil society. If one was to consider the demands of justice, enslaving Africans as civilly dead, but this was no injustice, he writes. Indeed, having by his fault forfeited his own life by some act that deserves death, he to whom he has forfeited it may, when he has him in his power, delay to take it and make use of him to his own service, and he does him no injury by it. That is, the slave master has absolute right to treat the slave any way he desires, because the slave has no right. The slave does not possess any right that the slave master ought to respect. Okay? Now, the kind of slavery existing at the time was one purely consistent with white supremacy. And economic gains at the expense of Black lives was certainly not conquest. Then you will have the French codes. The French code, the slave has no legal rights or legal representation. Slaves will not be allowed to be given offices or commission with any public function, nor to be named agent by any other than their masters. Again, here you have the master having absolute right over the slave. For the French Black Code, you have they had two forms of Black codes. One for Blacks that were in Paris, in France, and the other for Blacks in the colonies, Haiti, etc., and other places. Okay? And here he says, nor can slaves be party either in judgment nor in civil suits, either as plaintiff or defendant, neither in civil or criminal suits. That is, the slave has no right to be recognized. That's very fundamental. And you will see the same thing coming out of Locke's work. You come to the South Carolina slave codes. The South Carolina slave codes are highly informed by John Locke's fundamental constitution. As a matter of fact, if you look at the date, it's highly influenced by the pen of John Locke. It's highly influenced by the pen of John Locke. So a little bit of it here. He says, if any Negro or Indian slave shall offer any violence by striking or the like to any white person, he shall for the first offense be severely whipped by the constable, by order of any justice of peace, and for the second offense by any by lack of order shall be severely whipped, his or her nose slit, and face burnt in some place, and for the third offense to be left to two justices and three sufficient freeholders to inflict death or any other punishment according to their discretion. This is John Locke. This is John Locke, the one that talks about individualism, individual rights, and liberalism, and saying that slaves should be, subjected to the discretion of any person or their masters to the extent to which whoever is in that position can maltreat them. You see? And it is further enacted that all slaves shall have convenient clothes once every year, and no slave shall be free by becoming a Christian. That is very important. No slave shall be free by becoming a Christian. Okay, in volume 1 of the Rush for Black Diamonds, I talk about Locke and religion. Now, at that time, there was the notion that if you were baptized, then you could change your status from a slave to a free person. And there were instances in which you had some slaves doing that, but then it became a problem. It was banned. So when Locke says that no slave shall be free by becoming a Christian, he's intentionally establishing the claim that Christianity or your Christian status does not affect your social, political, economic status. Once a slave, always a slave, for John Locke. Once a slave, always a slave. Because remember, for John Locke, slavery, he was pushing this notion of slavery as indeterminate. Okay, as indeterminate for John Locke. And you will see the same thing with Thomas Jefferson as well, that slavery was indeterminate. Here you have the Louisiana Code, 1724. Again, the absolute right of the master, the influence of John Locke's fundamental constitution. It says, children issued from the marriage of slaves shall follow the condition of the parents and shall belong to the master of the wife and not of the husband. So even if slaves got married, there was the marriage for slaves, or if slaves got married, there was no formal recognition. In the Louisiana Court, it goes on to say, slaves shall never be parties to civil suits, either as plaintiffs or defendants, nor shall they be allowed to appear as complainants in criminal cases. Again, slaves could not bring a case against the master or any white person. But the master shall have the right to act for them in civil matters and in criminal ones, to demand punishment and reparation of such outrages and excesses as the slaves may have suffered from. Again, the slave is rightless, just like John Locke. He said, we declare that slaves can have no rights to any kind of property, and that all that they acquire, either by their own industry, or by the liberality of others, or by any other means, or tied to whatever, shall be the full property of the master, shall be the full property of the masters, and the children of said slaves, and the children said slaves, their fathers and mothers, their kindred, or other relations, either free or slaves, shall have no pretension. And it goes on. So what we see in the Louisiana Code, and what you also see in the fundamental constitution, is this attempt to make slavery indeterminate. Slavery will never end. And these pioneers basically were not looking for one day that slavery will end. No. They're looking at slavery as being there forever. Okay, again, in the Louisiana Code, you have slaves shall be incapable of all public functions and of being constituted agent for any other person than their masters, with powers to manage or conduct any kind of trade. Okay, nor can they serve as arbitrators or experts, nor shall they be called to give their testimony either in civil court. This is again the legality, the rights of the slave. Okay, but again, it will go on with respect to after slavery. So you have the Virginia Slave Code. Virginia Slave Code. Here you have the formalization, what I call the formalization of Black Africans as slaves and cattle, property. In Virginia, Virginia was the oldest colony, the first major, biggest colony in the United States for the British. But it was in Virginia that you had an absolute formalization of Blacks as slaves and cattle and property. Okay? It says from 1659, a Virginia law required or recognized slavery for the first time, although without defining it. The law provided that if the said Dutch or other foreigners shall import any Negro slave, the said Dutch or others for the tobacco really produced by the sale of the said Negro pay under the impost of 2 shillings per head. The like being paid by our own nation. By this time, slaves were seen as commodities being imported into the colony. This is Paul Fingerman. He said this was the first clear statement that Africans in new British colonies were considered things or property rather than persons. Again, in Virginia, you have the formalization here, this statement associated with the Constitution. And so whereas some have doubt have arisen whether children got by Englishmen upon a Negro woman should be slave or free, be it therefore enacted that all children born in this country should be held born or free, only accounting to the condition of the mother. This law gave slaves masters the rights to have affairs with their female slaves. The children of their affairs would not be the responsibility of the slave master or the white man, but of the enslaved woman. This is very important because when you come to Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson was involved in what is called slave breeding to multiply, based on this law, his slave plantation or slaves on his plantation. Why? Because, again, any white man could sleep with any slave free, willy-nilly, okay? And the child is not his child. And the child becomes a slave. And he can sell the child. Okay, and that was what Thomas Jefferson was involved in. So I will encourage you for this. Detail is in volume 2 as well. I mean, volume 1. Then you have the Florida Black Code. Okay, it said no person shall be a representative unless he be a white man. 1865, right after the Emancipation Proclamation. A citizen of the United States shall have been an inhabitant of the state 2 years. The senator shall be chosen by the qualified electors, on it goes. Blacks shall have no access to that. It said, be it further enacted that every person who shall have 1/8 or more of Negro blood shall be deemed and held to be a person of color. It was enshrined in the Black Codes of Florida. 1/8 or more of a Negro blood shall make you a Black person, a person of color. And finally, we come to Chief Justice Roger Taney. And this statement is very important. This statement is very important in light of where we are today. He said, Blacks are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. On the contrary, they were at that time considered as a subordinate, an inferior class of beings, okay, who had been subjugated by the dominant race. And whether emancipated or not, yet remain subject to their authority, and had no rights or privileges but such as those who held the power and the government might choose to grant them. So again, the rights, the citizenship or the rights of Black people is discretionary. The citizenship, according to Tenney, is discretionary. And what we see here, again, the legal analyst here will talk about it. But Tenney basically is saying the Black person has no right that a white person must respect. Okay? So this is the background, and we will go into our conversation. I'll stop sharing now. We'll go into our conversation. So I will ask each speaker to give take a minute or two, just talk about your the topic you talk about, and then thereafter each person will have 10 minutes. We'll begin with whoever wants to go first, but then for the 10 minutes, we'll start with Brother Joe.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Walters-Sleyon. I am pleased to be here with you and the other panelists this evening. I want to say greetings to two of my task force members who are on, Antonia Edwards, a task force member, and the project manager, Khalid Mustafa. You have done such a great job of talking about and giving the information on the code, on the Black codes. So even though you've given me that particular topic, I think what I'm going to take attorney privilege and talk about it from the standpoint of how it applies to what the work we're doing at the Boston Reparations Task Force, and what we're doing and how that applies to some of the things which are occurring currently in the United States with regards to what's happening with Black people. So that's what I would hope to be able to weave. I'm pleased to be amongst all you distinguished scholars, and hopefully I can add to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, who want to go for their 2 minutes? Just talk about what you're going to be talking about, and you'll come back. Dr. Simon?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm honored to be invited to join in this conversation. This is not a book you just read and put down. It's a book that you could teach many courses on and bring many people together to discuss with. But I'm hoping to learn from all of you. So I'm going to be very brief and just say three things that I've really taken away from this book. So I've spent most of my career studying mass incarceration, how it develops in the United States and what its consequences are. And I have to tell you that the question that has haunted me throughout these decades is how can a system that is so manifestly inhumane and racist actually survive scrutiny in a democracy, right, under the rule of law? And I think George's remarkable interdisciplinary book has given us, three important ways to understand that amazing persistence. One, you've just heard about the Black codes, but don't think of them just as laws. They're really a forward-looking way to reconstitute post-slavery punishment and law and order as a form of anti-Black supervision and a totalitarian scheme at that. And that has gone along with, frankly, a lack of legal accountability for any aspect of the law enforcement system, as long as its victims are Black or other people who fall short of the sort of white supremacist ideal in various ways. Secondly, and you just heard about John Locke, but the whole lot of Enlightenment thinkers, many of whom are discussed in these two volumes, have a deep commitment to a racist view of the African continent, generally of slavery in particular. The reason that's important, because a lot of other people did as well in that time, is that these are the thinkers that have given us the primary tools for thinking about punishment from a philosophical point of view. It is often said that the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment is meant to represent the influence that the Enlightenment philosophers had over the authors of the Constitution. But if we take into account their fundamental racism, we recognize that these concepts, as humane as they may be in abstract, cannot have real bearing on a world in which many, if not most, prisoners are going to be people of color who are simply excluded. So if we're depending on Kant's idea of human dignity, which is one of the most influential, you know right off the bat after reading George's book that that human dignity does not include people who miss that ideal. Finally, and here I hope to learn from all of you, is what I will call the following George, the necessity of a theological approach. We often treat crime and punishment as a problem of public policy to be debated with statistics and evidence. And that's important since so much of what we do is not based on any evidence at all. But it's also a deeply theological enterprise. I've been studying the long history of the carceral state, and it's basically theology, or I would call it idolatry, all the way down, because it replaces God really with the state as a religion. And it's been added to over the years. It's a cult of the state, it's a cult of white supremacy, it's a cult of capitalism, became a cult of eugenics in the 20th century, more recently, a cult of expelling people from their homes and community. So you can't defeat that with numbers. You have to have a counter theology, as I think George would call it. And he's given us a framework. If you read those chapters, that chapter on a reformist prison philosophy or theology, I'm sorry, he's given us a very productive framework for developing that theological perspective. And I'll be a student, believe me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Newsome, want to go, and then followed by Dr. Green?
Sure. Thank you for allowing me to be here, Dr. Walters-Sleyon. It's a pleasure. I come to learn. I hope I'll be able to add some elements of theology to the conversation as we go. But we all do theology every day. We decide who we are in relationship to the universe, to the God we've identified, and the context in which we live. So I'm glad to be here. I want to talk a little bit about how Locke and Kant are set up to believe in the inferiority of slaves. I also want to talk a little bit about Douglass's persistence and how he reads himself out of captivity. Very important. I want to talk about reading. The other piece I want to lift up as I close will be, what does this have to do with womanist theology? When Black women are included in the conversation, because we're assuming somewhere they're in the people, but we understand that it's white men, white women, Black men, and then Black women. So I want to talk a little bit about what slavery and Douglass's question means for Black women during this period of slavery. And I hope that we can have a hearty discussion.
Thank you. Dr. Green?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Walters-Sleyon, for this invitation. I bring, I guess, a newer scholarly approach as far as like a recently finished dissertation on the colored conventions of the 19th century. And in particular, I've been looking at the discourse and the rhetoric among those who helped to shape Black life, particularly through the African American culture, as participants in the colored conventions, both pre and post Civil War. And when analyzing the minutes within the colored conventions, particularly the addresses and the speeches, there is a little bit of a pattern, a discourse pattern that I'm noticing of where pre-Civil War, in light of the need to be a little bit more coded and to use theological language and moral language that was more coded within the scriptures as well as symbolic language, how that shifts as educational opportunities for what they were during the 19th century become more available, as well as to use a more contemporary word or phrase, I would imagine as more Black freed men and women become woke or aware, as we kind of may also refer to it as a double consciousness of the realities within the country and the lack of follow through post Civil War through the Reconstruction period as Black codes continue to evolve in places like South Carolina and conditions get harder for Black Americans to be able to have rights and to be able to exist under the same freedoms that are supposed to be available between the amendments. I'm noticing that through the minutes, and also as you look at certain sermons and just speeches that are given during that particular time in the South and the North, that Black leaders become more explicit in their demands for civil rights and for moving towards voting and for being more explicit in how they would develop its institutions. And so I hope to bring that to the conversation, as well as to talk about the role of the Black church, particularly not just as a religious institution for worship, but how it became a safe haven and also a place of cultivating ideas and scholarly conversations that helps to push back on the discourse that's kind of like proven through the existence of Black codes and how they grappled with providing organizational change through its civic and social societies that help to address these concerns for everyday Black women and men. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So let's get right into it, and we'll begin with Anthony Pfister. We'll give him 10 minutes or less to talk about his specifics here.
Thank you very much, Reverend Walters-Sleyon. Once again, I'm pleased to be here. You have wedged me between all of these scholars, so I'm going to try to hold my own with regards to presenting it from the standpoint of the topic that you've given to me. But let me just first say at the outset, and I think this was alluded to by the panelists who have spoken as well, that your 2-volume set of the Rush to Black Diamonds are a replete with historical relevance and necessity for everyone in order to read so that they can understand fundamentally what happened in the past and how it reflects on what is occurring here in the future. So let me speak about it from two ways. One is we talked about the Black codes, and as far as and what I find difficult as I read your books, as well as I focus on specific areas such as the Black code. As a Black man living here in the 21st century, it is difficult for me not to become enraged on the basis of what our ancestors have had to confront as far as white supremacy and the fact that they had no rights, they were considered property, that all of those things which you expressed when you talked about the various codes. So from the standpoint of what we're attempting to do, looking at the historical aspects of this, and certainly I've studied from this period of time all the way to the current time, but primarily looking at the civil rights movement. And as Reverend Green was talking about what he is going to be speaking of in terms of what we did as far as the Black community in trying to move our rights along during the civil rights era. What we're looking at right now, as in Boston with the Reparations Task Force, and taking in all of this history as well. And certainly your books will become a part of that conversation, Dr. Walters-Sleyon, as our researchers and we on the task force try to wrestle with the idea of what should reparations be for the city of Boston. And certainly I have some experts on here. Antonia Edwards, my fellow Reparation Task Force member, is with the Freedmen Bureau. She is looking at a number of these areas and is very astute with regards to that. What we have found is in terms of what is going on presently reminds me much and is embodied in what was in what you stated was in the Black codes. We talked about folks being viewed as property. Well, to a large extent, that has not changed, and it seems to be we're regressing back to that particular viewpoint. I know Dr. Simons is going to be talking about what is going on as far as with the mass incarceration, which became a new form of enslavement. I recall reading in your volume 1 where you started to talk about the fact that the prison system didn't become about until they started imprisoning Black people. That was one of the things that was pointed out quite vividly in your book. And I can say, as I believe that I'm learned, but I learned so much in your book in terms of the specifics that it's important for people to have the facts so they can speak intelligently about what has transpired over the years with regards to what has happened to Black people. So there are so many aspects of this which are going to be necessary for us to begin to look at, because as we talk about the whole concept of reparations, where there isn't much support for that in this country, it took uh, Congressman Conyers, the late Congressman Conyers, many, many years to even bring this to the forefront to us to have even a serious conversation about this. Just a few years ago was the initiation of that conversation in earnest in certain cities, such as Evanston, Illinois, here in Boston. We're talking about it in Massachusetts, here in Cambridge. We're talking about it in Los Angeles. We're talking about it even when we start talking about it in Tulsa. So there is at least the conversations that you are having now are underpinnings for the conversations that we need to have as we begin to start talking about reparations throughout the various places where I've mentioned. Yes, it's going to be a difficult conversation. It's going to be a difficult trying to find the remedies that rightfully should be put in place. As you will hear from Dr. Simon, certainly in terms of the question of the prison system being the new place of that incarceration being, and particularly as it relates to the South, being a new form of servitude. So we there is nothing that has changed as I viewed all of the codes in all of the various, be it Virginia, be it in South Carolina, be it the French codes. Everything points to the fact that, and quite frankly, as I was reading it, that nothing has really changed. So the reality is, as we look at this from a theological standpoint, as we look at this from a political standpoint, and certainly, as I've said in a prior panel discussion with you, Dr. Walters-Sleyon, I graduated as a political science major, studied Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, but I learned it from a white person's perspective, not from the history. And it was through your books that I learned of the real history of Lockean theory from the standpoint of slavery, Jefferson's use of the Lockean theory in order to address the Constitution. And I really say to folks, I don't, and I would have to query if there are Black persons who are going to participate in the 250th anniversary of this country, because we're not in it. We weren't intended to be in it. And it is clearly stated that we are not in it. So my sense is that's what I gleaned from the information that I've been entrusted to bring forth. I welcome the conversation from our other panelists, and I also look forward to hearing from the persons who are on here who may have questions about what we're doing here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We will have Dr. Simon now. Will speak for 10 minutes or less.
I don't think I need take up all of that time. I'd love to hear questions, but let me talk a little bit about mass incarceration. And there are myths about it as well as some important truths we have to grapple with. So I think the double myth, some people say it's a myth that it's primarily a war on Black people. And it's true that many people in prison are white, and sentences can be harsh on everybody who comes before our courts. But when you look at its history, its focus and its targeting of Black communities is undeniable, and it's integral to what it was really attempting to do in terms of the broad political economy role that I think it played. So let me highlight two ways in which Black communities became the primary focus of what we called back in the 70s the war on crime, right? The war on crime, which is something that Democrats supported, Republicans supported. It was viewed as an issue of national security, almost as important as the Cold War and standing down communism around the world. In fact, I'd say they're related in some ways because two things were happening that I think made the extraordinary investment that America made in arresting and caging predominantly Black communities, Latino communities as well, was due to primarily two factors that are integral in understanding why, when we talk about the new form of penal slavery, we're not just talking about people picking cotton or being forced to work, although they are. And in California, it's pennies by the hour for people doing hard work, cleaning tiers, making food, etc. But in many ways, it's not the labor of imprisoned people that is the real political economy payoff of mass incarceration. It's the way it redistributes power and opportunity in America in terms of urban and rural areas, white and Black communities. So again, briefly on these 2 points. One is, and here, if you're interested, the great book by Dr. Elizabeth Hinton, two great books. Her book on mass incarceration, from the war on poverty to the war on crime, but her second book, America Burning, which is about really how the insurgencies that were really raging in Black communities all over America in the 60s and 70s led to a massive effort to basically incapacitate young Black people who would otherwise have been seen as likely participants in uprising, riots, whatever words you want to describe it. And much of our criminal justice policy was written not with street crime in a conventional sense in mind, but as a way to sort of absorb the population that was otherwise possibly viewed as in open rebellion against America's form of both capitalism and racism in the 1960s and 70s. So that, that's one of the reasons people had to be locked up at the rate they were. They were feared. It's, that's the reason the Black Panther Party was dismantled, and many, if not most of its most active members, put in prison for very, very long sentences, if not out and out killed. I grew up in Chicago, where we saw Fred Hampton murdered. So we knew that they were willing to just kill people like in Argentina or Brazil or any other dictatorship. The second point is what I call, and following the great geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore, an abolitionist, the idea that the prison was essentially a fix to the political economy mess, really, that much of the country was in the 1970s as a result of deindustrialization and the increasing transformation of American cities into hubs of a new kind of economy, one based on consumerism, finance, corporate headquarters, universities. And in both regards, Black people were seen as a threat to this new economic future for cities. Industrialization had drawn Black people from all over the South to work in the industrial neighborhoods of cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, Detroit, Chicago. But by the 70s, those industries had gone. They had moved to the South, they had moved overseas. And these populations now were viewed as an impediment to redevelopment. And I think you have to look at mass incarceration and its disproportionate impact on Black communities the same way we now realize that the freeway system that was built in our cities in that same period was aimed at removing Black families and Black businesses from the central role they had come to play in our large cities. This is a process that's essentially over. San Francisco was 20% Black when I moved here in the late 70s. Today, it's probably under 5% Black, and that is true throughout most of the major cities of this country. So mass incarceration is said to have peaked in 2006 to 9. We are down about 30% from the peak prison population, but it doesn't show any signs of really gaining momentum toward a true dismantling of the conditions, of the lengthy sentences that have become elements of how inhumane the effect is. We have tens of thousands of incarcerated people who are going to die in prison because of the poor health care and the fact that they have sentences that last decades. I think there's a civil rights issue to be had here about letting so many elders pass away in settings of incarceration. It's important that, we've seen some effort to oppose this. I fear that it has run out of political momentum, and it's the kind of theological approach, especially a reinvigoration of the idea of human dignity, which I'll come back to in my closing remarks if we have enough time. So let me stop there and hope we have time for discussion and conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Seaman. Thank you. Okay, we have Dr. Sheila, Newsome, Imani, Camara. You are muted still.
Carefully researched what I could find about how you expose the issues of the Black codes. And I want to just say something about Locke and Kant. They are men of a greater context. The first slaves came into England in the 1500s. Not organized slavery, but slaves were present. Africans were actually called slaves and employed for a lifetime. No chance of freedom. So if we move back to the 1500s, here comes Kant and Locke at a time which the idea has already been embedded. Now, I don't know if that's in your research, but it seems to me that if it's 1500, when Locke and Kant show up, they are actually replicating a conversation that's been had in so many places already. With their writing, they codify those conversations. They codify a culture and shape a culture where it's okay to treat the African as other. So I can't imagine why people are shocked when they read Kant and Locke. If you do a close read, why anybody would be shocked that they would profess a philosophy of freedom and dignity for human beings, but not for African people, people of African descent, because those people are outside the norm. That's why they can be treated like animals. They can be treated any kind of way. That's why Locke doesn't feel any guilt about writing for the Constitution for Carolina. And the bottom line for me is that they are so esteemed. There are, I don't know, you can tell me later, if there are any challenges to Locke and Kant's ideas because they bring the Enlightenment. Was there any voice writing of anybody on the edge, either in philosophy or the church? So I'm just curious. That's a question for later. But what I really want to spend my time talking about is the fact that when Frederick Douglass is on the scene, he has actually have to read his way to freedom. Let me talk a little bit about that because we've got to read our environments. And I think that's why African people of African descent have actually managed to survive. I'm not sure I want to use the word thrive, but I want to go with survive. Douglass does not know his father. His mother is barely known to him. He is rebellious. He is somehow got the notion that he doesn't deserve what's happening to him. And he's clear about the fact that he's in the wrong place. And I want to talk a little bit about him reading the environment. We know that from Douglass's history that reading and knowledge didn't come to him until he was a slave of Edward Covey. And after he comes to Covey as a slave at the age of 8, I believe, it is Covey's wife who breaks the rule. She begins to teach him the alphabet. She teaches him simple words until her husband finds out and tells her, we're all gonna go to jail. You can't teach slaves to read. And so I believe that what Douglass begins to do is to not, if he can't read books, he reads the environment more and more. He reads the environment. And that's why he winds up being enslaved with Covey, but there's also another man who attempts to break his will, break his idea to articulate that he's somebody, And so he really does wind up being brutalized day and night by this man who's called a slave breaker. And yet Douglass survives that. It's only when Douglass winds up in the shipyards where he is working that he begins to take on his own ability to read. And he reads from the sides of ships. He reads from notes. He gives young white men bread and food so they will teach him how to read. And so by the age of 12, he's reading books and newspapers and begins to acquire his own thoughts about what it means to be a Negro in the Americas. So what I want to suggest here is there a way that we need to read out the system, read our way out? And I'm suggesting that reading is really not so much literature, it can be, but it's the conversations we have in our households, the conversations we have in the basements of our church for Sunday school, the youth groups we run. Are we teaching people a way to read their way out of slavery, out of problems, out of a penal system that never forgives, an education system that never educates? What are the pieces that would go with reading your way out of bondage look like? That's one of the questions that comes to me, and I'm really trying to think about that, having been a professor of education early in my career. So I don't also want to take 10 minutes, but I do want to wrestle with Frederick Douglass being considered a preacher, a public witness, a public theologian, who says that he understands the church as a place where slavery is condoned, but he also understands there's a different Christianity where he is valued. I would like very much to pursue that idea of Douglass, and I haven't read enough of the literature, but I'm curious. Where does he learn the difference between the slaveholding church and the freedom church? And you probably have an answer to that. So the bottom line for me is to move beyond Douglass for the last few minutes I have and ask womanist scholars, do they have a question for that Douglass could recognize or we might recognize? Douglass asked, what is July 4th to the Negro? Womanist thinkers, womanist theologians have asked a parallel question or questions. What is freedom to the Black woman whose body has been exploited? What is Christian ethics to women who've been denied real choices? What happens when Black women are excluded from womanhood because they are not white? So I'm really looking at the community that's got to read its way out, and then African American women who've got to read their way out to freedom. I want to pinpoint 3 educators. Sojourner Truth, who asked people in 1863, ain't I a woman? In fact, Truth is asking, what is womanhood to the Black woman when we have been defined as other? That really does parallel Douglass's question. And what's important for me to think about here is not only is Sojourner Truth talking to the white women's movement for power and the vote and autonomy, she's also talking to Black men. And I don't know where that's been explored, but if we understand Sojourner Truth as a womanist and a womanist scholar takes into account the well-being of men, children, and women, I would like to know where Sojourner's Truth comes to Black men, so that they do not see her as other, and then allow her to be exploited or allow themselves to be exploiters. Okay, the next person I want to talk to is Anna Julia Cooper out of Washington, D.C., who became a principal of the Frelinghuysen School, which I think becomes a university. I think the university is still there under a different name. Anna Julia Cooper is a favorite person of mine because she's an educator. And she says in her writings, it is only the Black woman who can say, when and where I enter the dignity of womanhood, and the whole Negro race enters with me. Now let's move. Sojourner is thinking about herself. Anna Julia Cooper has already expanded the question. Can the Black woman have dignity? And do people realize that she carries the burden of the Black community with her? And is that going to be a block to her gaining insight into how to promote health, wellness, and freedom for Black children in particular? Some of her students actually wind up at Harvard. So I'm curious about Anna Julia Cooper's kind of presentation, and what were educators, white, Black, otherwise, saying to her? Do you really bear the burden of Black men? How dare you? Because we're men. You know, I'm going to just mix it around a little bit. Is Anna Julia Cooper calling herself a mule? That comes out of Zora Neale Hurston. And is she bearing more than she should? A woman who gets a PhD in France in her 60s is bearing a lot, and she does that. The last person I want to talk to, because I think I'm running out of time, but maybe I'll do two more, is Katie Geneva Cannon, my mentor, who says, in ethics, you give ethics to everyone, but when you get down to the place of Black people, African people, there is an eraser that you apply. It may have been on the list, but by the time you get down to the list, Black people are not included in discussion of ethics because they do not have an autonomy to create their environment. They are still caught up in the system. So Katie's woman's question is, what is philosophy, what is Christian ethics to Black women when the conditions of moral choice have been restricted by sexism, racism, and economic exploitation? So she asks a similar question, Douglas, but she goes deeper. Finally, just to mention Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Grant, AME scholar, who actually talks in her book about white women's Christ, Black women's Jesus. And she argues that the thought of women's Christology has been the reflection of white women. And so if there is a theology, it needs to be constructed. It's got to be constructed by Black women. And so Black women do not fit the universal code of womanhood. And that's okay, because Christology, for the most part, has not been liberating to women and has certainly not supported the evolution of Black women's liberation. Christianity in general has concentrated on suffering and faith, but that suffering lands at the feet of Black women. Lastly, I think I'll go to Kelly Brown Douglas and then I'll stop, save some of this for later. Kelly Brown Douglas is someone who's done some work around criminology and the penal system. In her work, she said the Black body has been marked as chattel and is still chattel with a different label called criminal. It allows people to keep Black people, Black women, out of so-called free spaces. How many times have we identified for ourselves there's some place we don't belong and some place we shouldn't stay? Where do we get those hints? We get that from an environment that promotes all the time, you are in the wrong space. Free space is not Black space. It's not for Black men and it's not for Black women. So I am raising their concerns as a womanist scholar, but particularly Kelly Brown Douglas, who leans toward that there is no such thing as a free Black body, not male or female. So I think I'll just stop there. I have my own work to quote later, but that can wait because I want to give someone else time to present their scholarships.
Thank you.
Wow, so impressed. I want to just briefly just say my speech and just like get out get out of the way so that we can engage more in the dialogue. But I have been reflecting most currently on how ideology and particularly around ethics are developed within Black church spaces. And when we look at the Black church and its ability as an institution to cultivate ideology pre-Civil War, post-Civil War, and also just thinking about its contemporary status and era, there are some similarities, but there are some major distinctions that I think as we look at the timeline of codes that and laws that have evolved over time. Essentially, the Black church is birthed out of a need to have a space where, as I see it, Black free people can grapple with their questions, that they're not given the liberty to do so in white dominated religious spaces. And that is not just evident to religious institutions, but in all of Black life, where Blacks are the minority or not given the ability to create the social constructs and the rules. They are limited in how they're able to freely express who they are. And so I have been looking at these particular narratives and contexts from an Afrocentric lens that, as Dr. Asante says, places the African person or African descended person at the center, and not as the one who is being oppressed, but to look at what their life was looking like. And as we given such respect to Bishop Richard Allen and also the founders of Black churches who are leaders who step out on faith, as well as their ability to have vision and courage to develop a public institution that will allow persons to freely express themselves, not just in a way of their example of their religious life, their faith to God, but also how they're dealing with their everyday conditions and the everyday realities that they're dealing with. And I think it is one thing that we mention a lot, but I feel like it's what gets kind of overlooked often within the civil rights movement, and definitely in the Black Lives Movement today, and in a lot of the civil rights movements that are contemporary, is that there is a similarity around advocating for labor laws, because as leaders of congregations, our members, they work and they are dealing with unjust laws and just realities of what it means to be able to be an American, to be a global citizen. And the church has always been a place to advocate, or to be designed to be able to be a space where its leaders, its members could be able to unite together. I've also been re-examining our churches as a collective space, as opposed to just being a space where individualism is constructed as well as an ideal, which is very difficult. I mean, just most recently this week, the United States declared itself to rededicate itself back to ideology or a practice of what it considered it to be under God, which is quite, as I'm looking at it, quite distinct from the narrative that we preach in Black churches and in Black spaces of what it means to see, as James Cone says, a God of the oppressed. Because what was not a representation in the discourse and in the narrative that was expressed on Sunday was that God sided with those whose backs are against the walls, that the very people who are administering laws of deportation, of dehumanization, of confusion and evil in this country are also claiming themselves to be under the same God. And it is giving us, I think, all as contemporary scholars, the ability to kind of really think about where this ideology continues to stem from and the structural sin, and being able to name it as such, because it is now presenting itself as contemporary Black codes, where it is restricting our ability to see human bodies, Black bodies in particular, where from a Black maternal health perspective, Black women are still restricted on their ability to govern themselves and provide laws provide decisions that will protect themselves. Black queer people, particularly Black trans people, are also victims of those same types of that mentality that's behind Black codes and Black laws that restricts them from being able to have human dignity, as well as as you mentioned, in educational systems where families are grappling with how they could provide opportunities for their children when there are laws and codes that restricts even what they learn and how they can learn. And so if we're thinking about the role of the Black church and what it has been, even within its flaws and its own sometimes ability to enact its own restrictions and types of codes on its members within its institutions, I do beg to still believe that at its core, the Black church has still remained to be a space where it has opened its doors to be able to listen. It is not necessarily one where it has been without its own ability to be critiqued, but we are still able to have this gift of having an institution that is one that is to be ordained or blessed by God, which means there is a theological impetus where spirit can overcome human sin and what humans have done to create evil, and in its ways of creating evil laws. And looking at the biblical text as a way of seeing how God not just sides on the side of the oppressed, but how there is this type of emancipatory hope that we sometimes forget to mention as Christian scholars, as Black liberation scholars, that evil will not have the last say. And so Black Christian leaders, Black faith leaders must remind itself while looking to the past or looking at these examples of Black political movements, that there will come a day where Pharaoh will no longer be in power. And so what do we present as a message to our people in all of our spaces where we're existing, of what they can do to hold on in the meantime, and then how we are re-educating ourselves, unlearning and pushing our own narrative and ability to think beyond where we're at right now. And so this is a unique time because the conservative or Black or white Christian nationalist movement, the evangelicals, are very public about its discourse and is the ideology of who they want this country to, what they want this country to look like, and who they believe this country's laws should protect and value. And so it is time for scholars to come together. And again, the Black church is not the only institution that is able to be able to cultivate that movement. But I do think it is time for it to be very public in how it is cultivating this discourse. And so again, I thank you, Dr. Walters-Sleyon, as a Black faith leader, for, bringing this conversation to the forefront, but also now what we do next to develop ideologies that can be passed on in our spaces of institutional learning, as well as what we can do to affect change within our households. And so I want to give the rest of my time back and hope to see what comes next in our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So let's get ready for some questions. If you have a question, may I suggest you put your question in the chat, and I will read them and have the panelists respond to them. Okay? So I will begin with the question from Dr. Newsome, when you ask whether there were opposition to some of the claims of these philosophers. Yes, some there was some opposition. So take, for instance, you have David Hume. You know, in volume 1, I talk about David Hume. In volume 2, I also talk about David Hume. You had James Bertie. So David Hume was in Edinburgh, and James Bertie was in Glasgow. Both were Scots. But David Hume was so blatant about his racism that James Bertie critiqued him. And James Bertie said, what you are saying is really not true. You are being disingenuous and you are not being honest in your claims that Black people are intellectually inferior to the most ignorant white person. And that's what he was saying. That the most, David Hume was saying, the most quote unquote enlightened Black person, you know, is beneath the most ignorant or unschooled white person. And James Bertie was saying, that's not true. So you had this a person from Glasgow opposing David Hume from Edinburgh, you see, and both were Scots as well. You take Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant's own student, Johann Gottfried, opposed him because when Immanuel Kant came out with his 4 or 5 classes of people, at the top was brunettes and whites as the most superior. Johann Gottfried rejected that. He said, what you are saying is wrong because Kant was asserting what is referred to as biological racism. And Johann Gottfried says, that's wrong. And Johann Gottfried was his former student. You see? So, of course, there were people who opposed them, but their names are not often mentioned because these Kant, David Hume, Hegel, they have become the most prominent, quote unquote, Enlightenment officers or pioneers. You see? So, yes, indeed. So I'll stop there. Any question, any clarification someone wants to make? So in the chat, I see Pastor Alvin Riley. He asked the question, what about my mentor, Jacqueline Grant? And that's for you, Dr. Newsome.
I did mention Jacqueline Grant, and the book that I'm most familiar with is White Woman's Christ, Black Woman's Jesus. It is Grant who gives Black women, I want to say permission, but I think they already have permission, self-permission. She affirms that Black women need another kind of relationship with God. They're included in the kingdom. They have value. And if there's a Christianity that's preached or a Bible that's read where they're not included, there's a false theology there. So what I appreciate about her work is that she does not let the church off the hook. She does not let Black theologians escape. Kind of, well, we're over here tending to the church. And in a way, Grant asked what Douglass asked, what Frederick Douglass asked. What is the Black church? What is Black theology? What is the understanding of God and Christ to Black women? Again, there's enough work out there written by scholars, including Cone himself, who talk about manhood and personhood without identifying in any way the issues of Black women in Christianity. So I admire Dr. Grant for her stretch, because when she wrote this book, it was considered fairly risky and was read in classrooms, but I'm not sure it was ever read in the AME church. I'm pretty sure of that. Probably still hasn't been read in the AME church. I like your concern, Samuel Green, Reverend Green, because I think that our churches have forgotten how to be liberation spaces. And it's who has the best praise team, the best liturgical dancers, the best preacher, and all that. And I think that is a major problem. It used to be a place for education. And so I really support you in asking the questions you're asking. Why don't we do better? What would we have to risk? Whose approval we have to let go of? If we just went back to where Richard Allen started. You know, you got to read, you got to write, we got to start business, we got to support one another. We have no other place to go but here. And that's why the AME Church, for me, becomes the most provocative liberation space for a couple centuries. But now it seems, I've been AME, seems like all that's kind of gone. And what I see is a lot of prayer meetings, a lot of workshops on how to be better, how to pray harder, how do you know you're God's child? Well, if you can you always need work, you always need to work that. But if you're God's child in this context, what does it say about you? And what does it say about being in the United States of America? Where are those classes? Where are those Sunday school classes? Where are those workshops for women and men in separate venues? So that people can talk honestly about how they feel and what they wish could happen. You can't do anything in a Black church until people tell the truth. And
Okay.
where does that happen?
Thank you. Dr. Simon.
Just very briefly, inspired by a number of your points here, those who are speaking from some real knowledge of theology. And I'm wondering if we could do more as a community to counter what seems to me to be broad public misconception that the Bible supports severe punishment. We often talk about biblical punishments, and certainly some of the Old Testament ones were talking about brutal methods because it was a primitive society. But as George actually points out, like they never embraced prison because it's a destroying vision. Biblical punishments have a potential of expiation that I don't see in our modern punishment system. For instance, the idea of being kept in prison for an entire life, I would think would be an anathema to a true Christian or Judeo-Christian vision of even what punishment's for, because as one of the European Court of Human Rights judges put it in an interesting opinion, a punishment that has no end isn't really a punishment because you can't ever get on the other side of it.
Yeah. So in that light is, I mean, I think an important question is, what's next? What do we do next? How do we, whether in light of the rush for Black diamonds, in light of the Black codes, okay, and considering Supreme Court justice decision with respect to the administration's intentional effort to de-citizenize people. Furthermore, what's happening in Louisiana. And remember, Louisiana Black codes, okay? Louisiana Black codes are still central to what's happening in Louisiana as well. Okay, where do we go from here? I know Jofi said you talk about the Reparation Commission, etc., in Boston. But where do we go from here, panelists? What strategic initiative do we engage in?
Well, Rev, thank you for that question. I think, at least from my particular standpoint, one of the things I'm an activist in the approach that I think that needs to be done, and certainly in light of what is going on historically, and we saw ourselves as Black people come through the civil rights movement, we need to return to some of that type of activism that took place, and particularly now with what is going on during the currently with regard to the gerrymandering that's taking place, et cetera. We need to make sure that people become energized and activated in terms of participating in the vote. Because if that does not take place, this return, and again, it's at least my own view that what you set forth for the what you laid out with regards to the Black codes, as far as I'm concerned, it has continued to the present time in many different forms, and we're definitely getting a return to that with the policies that are being articulated at the present time. If we talk about gerrymandering, if we talk about what the Supreme Court, you talk about Chief Justice Taney, we've had good jurists on the Supreme Court who have advocated for particularly Thurgood Marshall and many in the Warren Court that did many positive things in terms of addressing issues during the civil rights era. And now we have in terms of an activist court in the other direction with Thomas and Aaliyah and Roberts doing what they're Alito and Roberts doing what they're doing. So if people need to get activated, they need to be energized, and they need to read the Rush for Black Diamond, volumes 1 and 2. It will enlighten them, it will energize them, it'll get them motivated in order to participate in the process. Because to not do that, then what Dr. Simon has stated in his remarks with regards to what will happen with increased incarceration. You spoke about what the final code that you mentioned was the one which says if you're 1/8 Black, you're Black. All of these things are issues which people must become enlightened for. And if we don't organize around this, if we take a laissez-faire, we do a matter of just saying that somebody else will address the issue, then what we're doing on the reparations task forces for North, what we're doing in trying to change the political characteristics in this country are for North, and we will have an increase in terms of incarceration. So we got work to do. And I think that out of all of this, that's the message that's being said, whether we come from a political perspective, an activist perspective, or a theological or religious perspective, we got work to do.
Mm-hmm. Any other panelists? We have a suggestion from Reverend Ivan Riley: speak truth to power or level, both preach, teach, become activists in our own respective areas of work. Jesus set the example of making disciples because this work is all divine. Antonia Edwards said National Book Club, Rush for Black Diamonds, etc. So any of the panelists want to chime in? Where do we go from here? What do we do?
Yeah, I do think that, as Dr. Newsome mentioned, that we do have to continue to shift from, I think, how we are using our time. And so Congressman Maxine Waters says, I'm reclaiming my time. And I think that we have to stop underestimating how just Americans, Black Americans, all people are, because they may not articulate things in the way that we are used to, or we may would like them to do so. I think by and large, the human population is tired of rhetoric that kind of looks like more of the same when there doesn't look like much is changing, or we keep going back and it's very clear of who the targets of certain laws are. And as much as you want to have an optimistic view of reality, it seems very much counter that there is a specific agenda where if you do not look a certain way or have a certain type of ideology, then this country is not for you. And I would beg to argue that even from a wider perspective of what the remnants of colonization has done to countries were a part of the British Crown, also exploited by the French and other colonies, that while there is emancipatory hope, I do think that one of the things that we could do immediately is to encourage a rising of a revolution where we are not just organizing together to be together, but being able to develop our own policies I am not too far removed from a radical sense that we might need to think about enacting a different, almost like a different nation within a nation, because that is where we have seen the distinct laws, the lines be drawn right now. And we cannot wait for there to be reconciliation or for transformation from those who continue to write laws that put us back into this idea or existence of Black codes. And so if our leaders, one of my friends, scholars, Dr. Frederick Ingram, says that we don't hate white supremacy enough, that we keep trying to make conditions to hope for a better day for those who continue to write these same types of laws or these same types of policies. And we must write a different law. We must develop a different theology that is not just reactionary to gerrymandering. It was great to see an organized group in the South. I mean, particularly from someone who grew up in the South, and to know the history and the importance of marching and organizing. But at the same time, I am asking for, where is the meeting to write policy? Why are we not pushing for more scholarly conversations that, while if it must exist on social media or in that public space, then can there be a day where we not just find one voice to follow behind, but where we are now developing our own future leaders? So Representative Jim Clyburn in South Carolina has had the Clyburn Institute that helps to breed, I'm sorry for that word, but to help develop future politicians and leaders who could be able to have a wide range. But at the same time, the practical side is that we have to invest financially into these systems that we are also creating. So it is a long journey and something that may not necessarily be answered overnight. But I do think that if we pull ourselves together for collective power and to develop strategies that it's not just the church here or the educational system here or those who are fighting for social justice in different ways, whether through mass incarceration, are here, but like there has to be a space where we're all coming together. And I do hope that from where I sit as someone who plans events, and not just events or experiences, but to help to coordinate a space where we can hear from each other in dialogue, and also, as the Color Convention suggests, that even in its discourse and rhetoric, there were decisions that were made on behalf of the collective. And we cannot wait on the federal legislature or state legislatures to develop policies that will be for the collective of those who are marginalized, that we can develop our own policies and develop our own codes that would benefit us and be able to challenge any systems of oppression, which we're seeing continue to emerge through its demonstrations. But, I go back to that question, well, how much will we hate white supremacy enough to lose our comfortability in certain spaces that would push back on the status quo?
So it's been a fabulous, fabulous, fabulous time discussing these. So I would just, if we can bring it to an end so we can have people watch the video, we'll put this out. I'll try to figure out a way to get the video to you guys. Fabulous, fabulous ideas, wonderful, insightful ideas as well. So can we just have 1 minute or less from all the speakers? Then I'll conclude it and we can say goodbye. Thank you to everybody. Who wants to begin?
I'll quickly go because I think I just want to also yield to the scholars who have put in more time than I have. But I served in South Carolina for a time before moving to Philadelphia. And I had an opportunity to visit a site, like I would consider a sacred ground, of what was the Brush Harbor, and or where churches, when they had to go underground, where they met and convened, and they worshiped, but prayed, and also sat with, from a lamentation perspective, of what the realities were during that particular time. And post-COVID, there was an argument to kind of return back to that space of sitting with and being able to just experience our human suffering. And there, time and time again, we keep seeing this need for the church to continue to be that space where people can cry out to God, cry out amongst each other in a communal space. And I sat with a group today where we're designing a retreat. And while we are so much in the rush to try to find a solution, that there is something that's more powerful in gathering the collective community, the beloved community, to come together and just cry out and to sit within this mess, not to get stuck, but to see where the divine voice is calling us to dance with God, to be able to kind of see God differently, and to hear collectively, to acknowledge the pain of those who are undocumented in this era right now, who don't understand where to go, as well as those who fear their rights to be able to vote and whether they will be heard. Can we still sit with that pain together? And what do we hear from God, from the divine, that might be our next step?
Mm.
I want to respond to Reverend Green and maybe others. I believe in the Black church, but I also believe that people have other places they can be now. Facebook, uh, you know, whatever else. There's 50 million. TikTok. Um, there's lots of places you can be. You don't even have to leave your house to see a movie. You used to have to leave your house, at least go to movies and eat bad popcorn. That's no longer a necessity. Where have people learned recently to converse and converse with integrity and honesty if that's not taught, if that's not asked for by the Black church that used to provide those afternoon programs, forgive me, where kids did recitations and two people sat on stage and talked about stuff, and people were like, do you agree with that? What do y'all think about that? Where is that going to happen, and who's going to start that movement? Now, some churches are already out there ahead of us. But if you're talking about the AME church, I have some questions. Having been ordained AME, I am not aware, and God forgive me, you can correct me, where people are pulling not just young people, all kind of people, young and old. I preached a sermon, and I'll stop, about the coming election for president, and I preached about who is our real candidate. And it turned out at the end of the sermon, it was Jesus Christ. And I was like, let's stand for our candidate, raise our hands and applause, blah, blah. And a person came to me after worship and said, we're going to be all right. We're going to be fine. I had just preached the world was on fire and we had to do something. And that was the response. And I was brokenhearted because I wanted to instigate at least people considering those conversations. And it had to come from the pulpit. I didn't hope. I didn't dance. I didn't turn around 5 times. The anointing fell, but nobody fell out. I'm just saying, the bottom line is, how do we bring people back to conversations in our churches? Because we only in worship for like an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours if the music is good. Where are we taught that? Everybody has to relearn that.
Mm.
Even pastors have to relearn it. Can we stop theologizing and listen to people? When they say, I don't know what to say, just say what you want. Don't worry. Well, I don't want to say it from the pastor, but it's like, honey, here it is. We're in our basement. There ain't no microphones in here. Where is that coming from? Great to talk at top as a theologian, a pastor, but we got to, but when you call a meeting, Will people come? Just go, it's something, man, Pastor always making up something. So I just want to raise that. I'll stop.
Thank you. Dr. Seaman?
Yeah, I'll be very brief because it's been a long and intense conversation. To me, I think the logical conclusion, and this might be a longer conversation or discussion, reading your books and hearing these discussions, is we need to hold up an abolitionist vision and not just a reform vision. And it seems to me there might be other countries where they can reform their criminal justice system because they don't have a history of slavery. But in countries that have had this history and this ongoing history that is not behind us, that keeps coming at us from the future, it's not behind our backs, it's in front of us. I think, and that doesn't mean that tomorrow there's no police, there's no prisons, there's no response. It means that we relentlessly and tirelessly and empirically try to find other ways to actually make people safe, to honor people's dignity, to keep our communities, integrated in terms of social solidarity. I think that can be done certainly without caging people, and certainly without caging people for eons the way that we do today. So I hope we'll have more opportunities to come together, and I certainly have learned a lot from everyone here today. I'm very grateful to have been included and wish you the best.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Seaman. And thank you, Dr. Camara, Dr. Green, Anthony Fister, who had to leave. And thanks all of you. Thanks to all of you that have held on and are still here. So I am very grateful that you've taken the time for us to have this conversation. I'm really, really grateful that the book is making gradual impact. And I'm available to come and speak, do presentations at your school, colleges, or churches as well. But the more we talk about this, we have these kinds of conversations, I think the better it is because it becomes therapeutic, it becomes inspirational, it becomes motivational. You see, creating the space for us to have these kinds of dialogue and discussions they go a long way. They go a long way. And briefly, my students are reading both volumes, and they are absolutely excited about it. And they are writing papers about it. And you wouldn't believe it, the extent to which a lot of other students because Bunker Hill is such a magnet college. It has students from all over Asia and Africa and the US as well. And some of them, they are shocked that they are now learning this history, you see. So I'm available, but thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for this wonderful, wonderful time. God bless you. We'll have the video and I'll put it on the website for the Center for Church and Prison. If your email is there, I'll email you the video as well. But thank you so much. I'm very grateful for you taking the time to be a part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.